2:10 in the morning, in the back kitchen of a restaurant on Atwells Avenue in Providence. The dinner service had ended 4 hours earlier. The only sound left was the exhaust fan and water dripping into an empty sink. Corinne Delaney stood with her back flat against the steel cooler door, a cracked phone pressed to her ear, her free hand clamped hard over her mouth to keep the sound in. She was 27. Her hands looked closer to 40, split open across the knuckles from the degreaser they used in that kitchen. The kind that opens skin and doesn't let it close. In a place like that, nobody's supposed to see you. You don't have a name there, just a number on the shift board. And after 11 months, Corinne was the best they had at being invisible. So she cried the way people only cry when they're certain nobody's listening. She was wrong about that. At the far end of that kitchen, there was a heavy oak door leading up to the second floor, and nobody on the kitchen staff was allowed to touch it. It opened a few inches, and a hand stayed on the brass handle. The man standing behind it owned the waterfront, the trucking union, and most of the money that moved on that side of the city. He heard every word. And what he did next? Nobody in that building would have believed. If stories about ordinary people and unexpected kindness stay with you, go ahead and tap that like button. Share this one with somebody who could use it tonight. And subscribe so the next story finds you. Now let's go back to that kitchen in Providence, where a woman has only 30 seconds left before her entire world changes. The silence had actually begun half a minute before her back hit that stainless steel refrigerator. In her apron pocket, the phone had vibrated, glowing with a name she maintained long after a funeral she could never forget. Nell. Corinne had kept paying for her late sister's number like leaving a coat untouched beside the door, until she could no longer afford the bill. The phone company sold the number, but the contact remained. When her trembling finger accepted the call, hoping against hope, a man's voice had answered, instead slow, gentle, and terrifyingly familiar. "No, Miss Delaney. I'm sorry. I'm not the person you were waiting for." It was Curtis Hodge. "Can you hear me?" he said. "Don't cry. I know calling at this hour is inconvenient, but I just heard something, and I thought it would be better for you to hear it from me than to find out tomorrow morning." He paused, and in the silence, Corinne heard the click of a lighter on the other end of the line. "The place where your mother lives called you this afternoon. 3 times. You didn't answer." She had seen those 3 calls. She had seen them while standing over a pot half as tall as she was, and she had turned the screen face down because she knew exactly what they were calling to say. She had told herself she would call back after her shift, that she would think of something, that somehow morning would come, the sky would brighten, and everything would be different. "They already sent you a letter," Hodge said. "You know that. The care fees are overdue. They gave you 1 extension, and you also know they won't give you another. At 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, they'll begin the discharge process. They'll ask you for an address so they can bring her home, Miss Delaney, and I find myself wondering which address you plan to give them." Corinne closed her eyes. Outside, beyond the kitchen's frosted glass door, her car sat in the rear parking lot, and on the back seat was a blanket she folded neatly every morning. "I don't mean to frighten you," Hodge said. His voice remained the same, still the voice of a man offering his condolences. "You can think I'm the kind of man who calls people at 2 o'clock in the morning to threaten them if you want. But sit down and think about it. Of all the people you know in this world, is there anyone who would answer the phone for you tonight? Is there anyone who would call to tell you what is about to happen to your mother?" She couldn't answer. That was precisely where he had driven the blade, and he knew it. It wasn't a threat. If he had shouted, if he had said something cruel, she would have had something solid to brace herself against and fight. But he didn't. He spoke in the voice people used when sitting beside a hospital bed, and no one had spoken to her in that voice for 2 years. "Don't cry," he said. "I'm not a bad man. I'm simply the only person left in this world who will still answer the phone for you right now." A sob escaped against her palm, short and wet, and she pressed her hand tighter over her mouth, so tightly that the cracked skin across her knuckles began to sting. The exhaust fan continued humming above her. Water continued dripping into the empty sink. "Now, here is how this will work," Hodge continued, and his voice changed, only slightly, but enough to make it clear that the condolences were over. "I have a way out. I can take care of it before 8 o'clock in the morning, and your mother will sleep in that same bed tomorrow night. But you have to speak with me right now, Miss Delaney, while I'm still willing to talk, because by morning, I'll be nothing more than an outsider, just like everyone else." Corinne slid down the refrigerator door until she reached the wet kitchen floor, And then she couldn't hold anything inside herself any longer. People would ask why she didn't hang up, why a clear-headed 27-year-old woman, fully aware of whom she was speaking to, would sit on a wet kitchen floor at 2 o'clock in the morning, holding that phone tightly against her ear as though it were something precious. The answer wasn't in that night. It was in a hospital corridor 2 years earlier, on the night her mother was brought in, and she sat alone on a plastic chair with a thick stack of paperwork in her hands, unable to understand even half of it. A man approached her, introduced himself as a family assistance specialist, and said the hospital had a program to help people complete their paperwork, entirely free of charge. He sat down beside her, borrowed her pen, and worked quickly and neatly, pointing to each blank space and telling her to sign here, then sign here as well. She signed. She didn't read everything. She was 25 years old that night. Her mother was lying behind a door she wasn't allowed to enter, and she would have signed anything if someone told her it might help. From that night on, the name Curtis Hodge began appearing in her life, first as a man who collected payments, then as a shadow she carried with her both when she went to work and when she went to sleep. The money came. The money saved her mother once, then saved her again, and the money never stopped demanding to be repaid. Sitting on the kitchen floor, Corinne held the phone in one hand and opened her banking app with the other, a motion she repeated so many times each day that her finger knew the way on its own. The number appeared. It wasn't enough to pay for even 1 week in the room she was renting, the room with 3 bunk beds and 1 locker for each person, charged by the week and paid in advance on Monday morning. It wasn't enough. It hadn't been enough the week before, either, or the week before that. During weeks like those, she didn't say a word to anyone. She finished her shift, walked out to the rear parking lot, opened her car door, lowered the seat, unfolded the blanket, and slept there until morning, when she went into the employee restroom to wash her face. She had learned how to do it without anyone knowing. She parked in the farthest corner, beneath the tall security light that had burned out long ago and that no one had ever replaced. She never slept more than 5 hours. Every morning, she folded the blanket neatly, making it into a perfect square, as though keeping it neat could somehow make it less of what it truly was. "Are you still there, Miss Delaney?" Hodge asked. "I'm still here," she said. That was why she didn't hang up. It wasn't because he held any power over her. It was because he was the only person that night who told her there was a way, and she had lived far too long in a place where there were no ways left. "Good," he said. "Then tomorrow morning, don't take the bus to your mother's place. Come see me first. I'll explain how it works." Then he hung up without saying goodbye, and the kitchen was left once again with nothing but the hum of the exhaust fan and the sound of dripping water. Corinne remained on the floor for a while longer, though she didn't know how long. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, stood up, and did what her body had grown accustomed to doing whenever her mind refused to work. She went to get a cleaning cloth. She wiped the cutting counter again. She scrubbed the sink she had already cleaned an hour earlier. On her way out of the kitchen, she passed the door leading into the employee hallway, where the weekly shift schedule had been posted. She stopped in front of it, as she did every night, to see whether she had been given any extra shifts for the following week. The head chef's name was on that schedule. So were the names of the 2 kitchen assistants, the waiter who was always arriving late, and the night manager. Then, at the very bottom, beneath the black line separating the kitchen staff from the cleaning staff, there were 3 rows without anyone's name. There were only 3 strings of numbers. The second row was hers. She hadn't taken 3 steps down the hallway when the phone vibrated again. The same name appeared on the screen, her sister's name, and this time there wasn't even a single second when she believed the impossible. She went back into the kitchen, walked to the sink, and because her hands were wet and trembling, she placed the phone on the cutting counter and turned on the speaker. "I changed my mind." Hodge's voice rang through the empty kitchen, louder than she had expected, striking the stainless steel surfaces and echoing back. "I don't think being too kind to you is good for you either. You can come see me tomorrow morning, but you'll have to bring part of the payment. Not much. Just enough for me to know you're still serious." Corinne stared at the phone lying on the wooden surface. "I don't have anything," she said. "You do," Hodge replied. "People always have something, Miss Delaney. They just haven't been willing to look for it yet. Think about it. By morning, you'll find something. Everyone does." And that was when she heard the door. It wasn't the sound of hinges. The door was made of heavy oak and had been installed with care, so it made no sound. What she heard was the change in the air, the way a large kitchen could suddenly become smaller. She turned her head. The man stood at the foot of the stairs, one hand still resting on the brass doorknob. He was 34 years old, with closely cropped black hair and a dark shirt, and he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the phone. Corinne straightened. In the 11 months she had worked in this kitchen, she had never been in the same room with him for longer than it took them to pass each other. She opened her mouth to apologize, to say she would finish cleaning right away, to say any of the things people said when they were caught doing something they weren't permitted to do. She couldn't make a single word come out. He stepped into the kitchen. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask what the debt was for, how much she owed, or how long she had owed it. He walked past her, neither quickly nor slowly, and picked up the phone from the cutting counter. "What is it? Is someone there with you?" Hodge asked, still speaking with the ease of a man holding the longer end of the rope. "Miss Delaney, who are you letting listen?" The man raised the phone. "Hodge." He spoke only one word. He said it no louder than the hum of the exhaust fan. And in that kitchen, the word brought everything to a stop. The other end of the line went silent. Corinne stood 3 steps away, and she could hear that silence with perfect clarity. The sound of a man who had been speaking so smoothly only moments earlier, and suddenly couldn't find a single word. Then Hodge's voice returned, and it had changed. "Mr. Marchetti, you called my house," the man said. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know. I was calling her. I had no idea she worked there. You have to believe me. You called my house at 2 o'clock in the morning." He let the sentence remain there. He added nothing after it. There was no threat, no word about what would happen, and no name was mentioned. He simply remained silent, and that silence stretched longer than any man could bear. Corinne could hear Hodge breathing through the speaker. "Mr. Marchetti, this is business." She signed the paperwork. "I have all the proper documents. That no longer exists. The debt no longer exists. The interest no longer exists. Tomorrow morning, the place caring for her mother will receive a call from you, and you'll tell them you made a mistake with the file." There was a sound on the other end of the line, the scrape of a chair being pushed back. All right, I'll do it. "There is one more thing," the man said. "You owe me a payment. I call it compensation for disrespect. You know where to deliver it. Mr. Marchetti, you heard me clearly. I won't say it a second time, Hodge." He lowered the phone from his ear. He didn't end the call with force. He pressed and held the button on the side until the cracked screen went completely dark and the phone shut down, then placed it on the cutting counter, in exactly the same spot where Corinne had first left it, straight and orderly, as though returning a knife to its proper place. The entire exchange lasted less than 90 seconds. Corinne was still standing exactly where she had been. Her hands were still wet. Water continued dripping into the sink behind her, and she realized she could hear it with startling clarity, so clearly that it was almost unbearable, because there wasn't another sound left in the kitchen to hear. He didn't leave immediately. He stood there beside the cutting counter, looking at the phone he had shut down, while Corinne remained 3 steps away, uncertain whether she was permitted to move. She thought about thanking him. She thought about apologizing for being there, for turning on the speaker in someone else's kitchen, for allowing her outside life to spill into a place where she was paid to keep it from spilling. She couldn't say a single word. Her throat closed. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. He still wasn't looking at her when he asked. 11 months, she said. He gave a slight nod, as though recording the number somewhere. "What is your name?" And she answered. She answered quickly, without thinking. Out of the reflex built through 11 months of standing before the shift schedule every night. The reflex of someone who had learned that when a superior asked a question, she had to respond immediately and give exactly what was needed. She recited her string of numbers. The 3 numbers on the second row beneath the black line. She heard her own voice speaking them aloud in the empty kitchen, felt her face grow hot, and corrected herself at once, hurriedly, like someone who had just dropped something. "I'm sorry, sir. Corinne Delaney." He had been about to lower his hand onto the counter. That hand stopped in midair, about a hand's breadth above the wooden surface, and remained there. He didn't move. She saw him swallow once, saw his jaw tighten and then release, and watched his shoulders sink the way a person's shoulders sank when all the air had left his lungs. Then he turned his head and looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. It wasn't the gaze of a man assessing an employee, nor was it the look of someone trying to remember where he had met another person before. He looked at her as though he were staring through a door that had just opened in a place where no door was supposed to exist. Corinne endured that gaze without understanding any of it. She lowered her eyes to her hands, to the red, cracked skin across her knuckles, and wondered whether she had said something wrong, whether people here weren't permitted to have last names, whether she had just lost her job. Then he spoke, but not to her. Renato. From the direction of the dry storage room came the slow footsteps of an older man. The head chef appeared in the doorway, still holding a dish towel, his hair damp with sweat. He stood there, his eyes moving from the owner to the woman who cleaned the kitchen and then back to the owner, without asking a single question. "Make her something hot," the man said. "She eats at the table, not on the floor." Renato nodded. The man left. He walked toward the stairs, no faster than he had descended them, without looking back, giving another instruction, telling her whether she could leave or had to stay, asking whether she needed anything, or asking whether she was all right. When he reached the foot of the stairs, he lifted his hand to the brass doorknob, and there he stopped. His hand rested on the knob without turning it. One beat, only one beat, but long enough for Corinne to realize that it had lasted longer than it should have. Then the door opened, and he went upstairs, and the sound of his footsteps disappeared across the wooden floor of the second story. Renato placed a skillet on the stove without saying anything. He cracked 2 eggs, chopped a few things from the refrigerator, and the scent of hot food began to spread through the kitchen that only moments before had been so silent it was difficult to breathe. Corinne leaned against the sink, her arms hanging at her sides, and let her mind replay everything that had just happened, replaying it slowly, like someone retracing each step of a staircase in the dark. The debt was gone. The debt that had weighed on her for years. The debt that had taken away her sleep, condemned her to those weeks in the car, and taught her to turn her phone face down whenever she saw a call coming in, had disappeared in 90 seconds, in a kitchen, sometime between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. And she realized 2 things. Throughout those 90 seconds, the man had never once raised his voice, and he had never once asked why she was in debt. She couldn't sleep. She ate everything on the plate Renato placed before her, leaving it completely clean, because it had been a long time since anyone had cooked her a hot meal, and her body knew how to accept whatever it was given. But when she reached the parking lot, she simply sat in her car with both hands resting on the steering wheel and stared at the burned-out security light in the corner until the sky began to change color. The debt was gone. She repeated those words in her mind again and again, but they still refused to sink in. Yet there was one matter no one had mentioned in the kitchen the night before, and it was the reason she couldn't sleep. The man had ordered Hodge to call the nursing home and say that he had made a mistake with the file, but the overdue care fees weren't Hodge's responsibility. They were hers, and they were still there. And at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the staff would begin the process of discharging her mother. She left the parking lot while the sky was still gray. It took 2 buses. The first was nearly empty, while the second was crowded with people on their way to early shifts, sleeping with their heads against the windows. She bought a cup of coffee from the machine in the lobby because she needed something to hold in her hands, and she arrived well before the scheduled time, earlier even than the hour when visitors were allowed inside. She entered through the side door, past the reception desk, and the person on duty didn't look up. The second-floor corridor was still dim, illuminated only by the night lights spilling across the vinyl floor, while a dehumidifier hummed somewhere at the far end of the hall. Corinne walked to her mother's room, the room she had entered more times than she could count over the past 2 years, the room she could have found in the dark, simply by counting the doors. She pushed the door open. The bed was empty. Not empty in the sense that someone had merely gotten up and gone somewhere. The sheets had been stripped away, leaving the pale blue, glossy mattress bare. The safety rails on both sides had been raised, and the head of the bed had been lowered until it lay flat. The bedside cabinet had been cleared of everything. The plastic chair where she always sat had been pushed against the wall. The cup of coffee slipped from her hand. It seemed to fall very slowly during those 3 seconds, and she heard it strike the vinyl floor and heard the lid burst free, but she didn't look at it. 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she understood everything. They had completed the discharge process earlier than they had said they would. They had asked for an address, and no one had been able to give them one, so they had taken her mother outside the gates, a woman who couldn't walk on her own and couldn't finish an entire sentence, leaving her somewhere outdoors on a February morning in Rhode Island, to wait for a daughter who was sitting on a bus. Her knees gave way. She had to reach out and grip the doorframe. "Miss Delaney." Corinne turned around. Marlene Pruitt stood at the end of the corridor with a folder held against her chest, her wool coat still fastened tightly at the neck like someone who had only just arrived. She walked toward Corinne with the measured steps of a person who had already decided that this conversation would be difficult. "Where is my mother?" Corinne asked. Her voice made no sound. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Where is my mother?" "Faye was transferred early this morning," Mrs. Pruitt said. She spoke in the voice trained for sentences like that. A calm, courteous voice that merely delivered the news without taking any part of it upon itself. "The vehicle arrived before 6 o'clock. We have a complete record of it. Transferred where?" "Mrs." Pruitt opened the folder. She turned one page, then went back to the previous one, then stopped without saying anything. "Transferred where, Mrs. Pruitt?" "I'm confirming that now," she said. And for the first time in the 2 years Corinne had known this woman, there was a tiny fracture in the middle of that calm voice. "Give me a few minutes. Some paperwork arrived during the night, and I wasn't notified in advance. I only started my shift 10 minutes ago. You don't know where my mother is." "I know she is safe," Mrs. Pruitt said. "I know someone came for her, that there was a medical transport ambulance, that a doctor accompanied her, and that her records were transferred according to the proper procedure. What I don't know is who paid for it, or why the balance on your account here became 0 at 6 o'clock this morning." She looked down at the folder in her hands. "Miss Delaney, I've worked here for many years. I've never seen anything like this before." Mrs. Pruitt had to make 3 phone calls before she found the name. Beckwith House. Corinne knew that name. Knew it the way people knew the name of something they would never be able to reach. It stood south of the city beside the bay, and whenever she sat in the waiting room at the old facility with the application forms for the assistance program in her hands, someone would mention it and then leave the sentence unfinished, saying just enough to make it clear that they knew. It was the best facility in the state. She took one more bus, then walked the final stretch, because the route didn't go all the way there. The entrance didn't look like a medical facility. There were wooden floors, no smell of bleach, and a vase of fresh flowers stood on the reception desk. Corinne stood before that desk in her old coat, her hair tied back with a rubber band from the kitchen, her hands cracked across the knuckles and automatically tucked into her pockets. She gave her mother's name. The woman at reception pressed a few keys and looked up, and what frightened Corinne most wasn't that she couldn't find her mother. It was that she found her immediately. "Faye Delaney, 3rd floor, 1st room in the East Wing. You're her daughter, aren't you?" On the way upstairs, an employee accompanied her to finish the paperwork for identifying a family member. He flipped through the file as they walked, then slowed in the middle of the corridor. "Miss Delaney, there is something you should know." He pointed to a line. "According to the transfer documents, you aren't listed as Faye's family representative. There is another name here. We received the records exactly as the previous facility sends them, but this will have to be clarified, probably sometime this week." Corinne stared at that line for about 2 seconds. She hadn't slept. She had ridden 3 buses, and her mother was somewhere behind one of these doors. "Whatever is wrong, I'll correct it," she said. "Can I go in now?" He nodded and opened the door. The room had a large window. That was the first thing she saw, before the bed, even before her mother. The window occupied almost the entire wall, and beyond it lay the bay, the gray water of February, several boats anchored in the distance, and so much light pouring into the room that there was no need to turn on a lamp. It was a private room. 1 bed. There was no sound of someone coughing in the bed beside hers, no plastic curtain drawn between them, no smell of 4 people sharing the same room. Her mother was asleep, the head of the bed raised, one hand resting outside the blanket. Someone had washed her hair. Corinne stood in the doorway and couldn't make herself go inside. A woman in a lab coat approached from behind and handed her a clipboard to sign, and Corinne signed without looking. Then she asked the question she had been carrying inside herself all morning. "How much do I have to pay?" "Nothing at all," the woman said. "How can it be nothing? All of your mother's care has been paid in advance. Not for 1 month, Miss Delaney. Her entire course of treatment has been covered, including all the dialysis she'll need in the future, for many years to come. The same is true at her former facility. The balance on your account there became 0 early this morning." Corinne heard the words but couldn't understand the sentence the woman had spoken. She asked again. The woman gave her exactly the same answer. "Who?" Corinne asked. "I can't tell you that. I need to know who did this." "Miss Delaney." The woman lowered the clipboard. There are no miracles. There is only money, and a name I'm not permitted to say aloud." Then she walked out and closed the door very gently behind her. Corinne approached the bed. She sat in the upholstered chair beside it, not a plastic one, and looked at her mother's face in the light coming from the bay. She had grown much thinner than she used to be. After a while, she opened her eyes slowly, and her gaze traveled around the unfamiliar room before finding her daughter. Her hand lifted slightly from the blanket. Corinne took it. "I'm here, Mom." Faye's mouth moved. She managed one sound, stopped, then tried again, and the sound that finally emerged was a name, Nell. She said it very clearly. She looked at her daughter and called her by the other daughter's name, and she tightened her grip on Corinne's hand a little, like someone who had just found something she had lost. Corinne sat perfectly still. She placed her other hand over the back of her mother's and said, "Yes, Mom." Then she lowered her mother's hand onto the blanket, smoothed the blanket flat, walked outside, and closed the door. The third-floor corridor had a wooden railing overlooking the lobby. Corinne walked to it, placed both hands upon it, and held on. The following evening, she still went to work. She didn't know what else she was supposed to do. The evening shift ended. The kitchen assistants left one by one, and the waiter was the last to go, switching off all the dining room lights behind him. Corinne began her work as she did every night, scrubbing the grease traps, washing down the floor, and pulling out the small ladder so she could clean the top of the ventilation system. Renato didn't leave. He sat on the high stool in the corner of the kitchen, with a glass of water, both feet resting on the lower rung, and remained there longer than a man who was merely resting his legs would have. "Miss Delaney." She stopped working. Since the night before, people had begun speaking her last name aloud in this kitchen, and she still wasn't accustomed to hearing it. "Come here. I want to show you something." He went into the staff room, opened his locker, and removed a leather-bound notebook from the bottom. All four corners of the cover were worn. The spine had been repaired with tape that had yellowed with age, and it was thicker than she had expected. He placed it on the cutting counter and opened it. Corinne saw lined pages crowded with handwriting, one row beneath another, the color of the ink changing across long stretches, blue in some places, black in others, and faded elsewhere. Every entry was a person's name. "Who are these people?" she asked. "They're us," Renato said. "Everyone who has ever worked the night shift in this kitchen since I first started here. Whenever someone arrived, I wrote the name down. Whenever someone left, I recorded the final date. No one is missing." Corinne looked at the long column of names. "Why do you keep this?" "Because no one here writes our names down anywhere," he said. "So I write them down myself." He pushed the notebook toward her. "Turn the pages." She did. She turned them slowly because the paper on the earliest pages had become brittle. Some names occupied only one line, while others took up two because those people had left and later returned. In some places, the ink was much darker, where Renato had traced over a word again and again to make it clear. There were men's names and women's names, names that sounded as though their owners had only just stepped off a ship, and she realized she was truly reading them, every single one, instead of merely letting her eyes pass over them. Then, somewhere near the middle of the notebook, on a page yellowed with age, her hand stopped. There was one line written in blue ink, a woman's name, followed by the last name Marchetti. Corinne said nothing. She sat perfectly still, staring at that line, and the hum of the exhaust fan above her suddenly sounded much louder than it had 1 second earlier. Renato reached across and placed his finger on the page, not on the name, but at the end of the line where he had recorded the date the woman left. "This," he said, "was her final entry. I wrote it with this very pen." He took the ballpoint pen from his shirt pocket, then put it back. "I remember that night because she covered someone else's shift. I remember because I was the one who made the schedule. It was a Tuesday night." Corinne didn't ask where the woman had gone. There were certain questions people didn't ask in a kitchen at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, and Corinne had spent enough years living beneath the surface of everything to know which questions they were. Renato didn't say anything more about her. He closed the notebook, pressed his palm against its worn leather cover, and sat that way for a while. "You've worked here for 11 months, he said. "Yes. Haven't you noticed?" "Noticed what?" "He only comes down to the kitchen on Tuesdays." Corinne looked at him. Renato didn't look back. He stared at the sink on the other side of the kitchen, the sink that had been dripping throughout all 11 months, without anyone calling someone to repair it. "Not Monday." not Saturday. They hold meetings upstairs on all kinds of nights. He enters through the front door and leaves the same way, and I never see his face. But on Tuesdays, he comes down here. He stands at that sink and washes his hands. Some nights, he leaves as soon as he finishes. Other nights, he stands there longer. Renato turned his head toward her. The night you cried down here was a Tuesday, too. Corinne opened her mouth, but no words emerged. The skin on the back of her neck turned cold, the kind of cold that came first and brought understanding only afterward. Renato picked up the notebook, tucked it beneath his arm, and rose from the high stool with the slow movement of a man who had spent his entire shift standing. "I'm not telling you anything," he said. "I'm only telling you that Tuesday is Tuesday." Then he walked into the staff room, returned the notebook to its place at the bottom of his locker, turned the lock, and went home. Corinne was left alone in the kitchen. She pulled out the small ladder, climbed onto it, and continued wiping the top of the ventilation system, the place no one could see and no one ever inspected, until her shift was over. At the end of her shift, she still had 2 large bags of trash to carry to the dumpster in the alley. She pushed the side door open with her shoulder, because both hands were full, and the moment she stepped outside, she understood that she shouldn't be there. It had just stopped raining. The concrete in the alley was still wet, shining black beneath the only light mounted on the rear wall of the restaurant, and within that pool of light, a car was parked sideways with its headlights off and its engine still running. 2 men stood beside the rear door, their hands clasped in front of them, saying nothing. And in the middle of the alley, on the wet ground, a man was kneeling. He was somewhere in his 50s, wearing a respectable coat, his hair carefully parted, the kind of man people addressed as sir during the day and greeted with a handshake at the entrance to an office. The knees of his dress pants had darkened with water. No one was forcing him down. No one was touching him at all. He had knelt of his own accord, and he kept talking, repeating the same sentence again and again, with only slight changes to the words. "Give me more time. Just until the end of the month, please. Give me a little more time." Elias Marchetti sat on the hood of the car. He sat at a slight angle, one foot planted on the ground, both hands resting on his knees, and he didn't say a single word. He only watched. Corinne stopped on the doorstep with the 2 bags of trash still in her hands, and didn't dare set them down, because the bags would make a sound against the concrete. What made her blood run cold wasn't the 2 men standing beside the car door. It was the silence of the man sitting on the hood. Because no one in that alley was giving orders, no one said anything about what was going to happen, and not a single name was mentioned. Yet the kneeling man kept talking, speaking faster and faster, in the voice of someone desperately trying to fill an emptiness that only another man had the power to fill. The time he was begging for didn't belong to him. It belonged to the man who sat in silence. Everything in that alley, everything the kneeling man possessed, including his respectable coat, his carefully parted hair, and the morning awaiting him, now rested in a place he couldn't reach. Elias rose from the hood of the car. He reached inside his coat, took out an envelope, and stepped forward. The kneeling man stopped talking. He looked up, and his whole body contracted slightly, the reflex of someone waiting for something to happen. Elias held out the envelope at a height that forced the other man to reach up for it. "Stand up," he said. "I have no use for a man on his knees." The man accepted the envelope with both hands. He stumbled to his feet and began thanking him, speaking profusely, but Elias had already turned his back before the man could finish his second sentence. The 2 men beside the car opened the door. No one pushed the other man away, and no one escorted him out of the alley. They left him standing there with the envelope in his hands, alone in the middle of the alley with wet knees, and the car drove away, leaving him in exactly the place where he stood. Before the car began moving, Elias turned his head toward the restaurant's side door. Corinne had managed to retreat half a step into the shadow of the doorway. She didn't know whether he had seen her. She only knew that his head turned directly toward that spot, remained there for 1 beat, then he entered the car, and it drove away. She stood in the darkness for a long time after the alley was empty. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her ears. Then she stepped outside, lifted the lid of the dumpster, and lowered the 2 bags into it as gently as she could, as though someone might still be out there listening. 2 nights later, she was sent upstairs to clean after a gathering. It was the first time she had ever been on the 2nd floor. She was told to work quickly, clean everything thoroughly, and open no drawers. She collected the glasses and wiped the long table, and on a smaller table beside the door lay an open appointment book, the kind with a hard cover and time slots marked in a grid. She didn't mean to read it. Her eyes merely passed over it as she lifted the tray, then stopped. She recognized one name because she had seen it on campaign signs planted on front lawns throughout the fall. Another belonged to the president of the Dockworkers Union, whom she knew because some of the kitchen assistants had mentioned him. The third was displayed in brass letters across the front of the tallest building in the city. 3 names, 3 different appointment times on the same evening. And beside all 3 appointments, someone had written the same word in ballpoint pen: wait. She returned the book to the exact angle at which she had found it and carried the tray of glasses downstairs. On her way down, she passed Dale Whitcomb at the foot of the stairs. He was recounting the time slips, and he held one out to her. You were 2 minutes late last Thursday. I'm deducting it. Corinne took the slip, looked at it, then put it into her apron pocket. Yes, she didn't argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with Dale meant losing a shift the following week, and losing a shift cost far more than 2 minutes. She entered the kitchen. Trevor Lund stood beside the coffee machine with 2 paper cups in one hand, and he gave her one without asking anything. No sugar. Of all the young men who came and went through the side door, he was the only one who remembered that she drank her coffee without sugar. Then he went outside to his car, leaving her alone. 2 objects lay side by side on the cutting counter. One was a small jar made of thick glass, with a metal lid and no label or writing of any kind. The other was a key. Corinne stood looking at them for a long time before touching either one. She picked up the key. It wasn't a door key. It was a locker key, the thin kind with a number stamped into the shaft, and the number stamped there wasn't the number of her locker. She walked into the staff room. A row of more than a dozen lockers stood there, painted gray, each door dented at the lower corner. Her locker was near the end, with a curling strip of masking tape on its door and her number written on it in marker. She walked past it. The locker matching the key in her hand stood at the beginning of the row, in the brightest spot, directly beneath the light. There was no masking tape on its door. Instead, a strip of black plastic had been neatly fixed across the center, the kind produced by an embossing machine, with raised white letters. Corinne Delaney. She stood before it with the key in her hand and didn't open it. She raised one finger and traced each raised letter. Her knuckle cracked as it touched her own name. In that entire room, across more than a dozen locker doors, it was the only label bearing a person's name. Are you planning to stand there until morning? She turned around. Elias stood in the staff room doorway with his sleeves rolled up. He looked at her once, then lowered his gaze to her hands. The jar outside is yours. You can't buy that kind at a drugstore. Apply it every night before you leave, then once more in the morning. Corinne opened her mouth. Mr. Marchetti, People with infections have to miss work, he said. I don't like replacing people. Then he left. She heard his footsteps ascending the wooden stairs, followed by the heavy oak door closing. Corinne returned to the kitchen. She washed her hands with warm water, patted them dry, and opened the jar. The ointment inside was cloudy white, odorless, and thicker than she had expected. She took a small amount on the tip of her finger and rubbed it over the knuckle of her right index finger, where the deepest crack split open whenever she closed her hand. The burning vanished. It didn't gradually fade. Within about 10 seconds, it was completely gone. The burning she had carried for 11 months, the burning she had grown so accustomed to that she no longer called it pain, only the way her hands were. She rubbed the ointment over both hands. Then she stood leaning against the sink with her hands still slick from the medicine, not daring to bury her face in them, and remained that way in the empty kitchen, alone, until the first wave had passed. The following Tuesday, at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, she was kneeling and scrubbing the seam where the floor met the base of the stove when the heavy oak door opened. Corinne didn't stand up. Over the past several nights, she had learned that standing only forced him to say something to her, and he didn't like being made to speak. Elias walked behind her to the sink at the far end of the kitchen, turned on the water, and began washing his hands. He washed them for a long time, thoroughly, scrubbing past his elbows, the way someone washed when he practiced a profession entirely different from the one Elias appeared to have. Everyone in the kitchen knew he didn't use the guest restroom, and no one asked why. Why do you keep this place? Corinne heard herself ask. She hadn't meant to ask it. The water continued running for several more seconds before he turned off the faucet. Go on. She sat back on her heels. I've worked here for 11 months. I see the meat invoices arrive every week, and I see half the tables out there sitting empty every night. This place loses money. A man like you would have closed it long ago." Elias took a paper towel and patted his hands dry without turning toward her. "When I was young, there was a child who sat in this kitchen, waiting for his mother to finish her shift. Everyone on the night crew knew him, so they let him sit in the warmest place, beside the base of the stove, exactly where you're kneeling now. Renato cooked for him every night, and whatever Renato made, the boy ate. This place doesn't lose money, Miss Delaney. This place is paid for." He dropped the paper towel into the trash. Corinne let those words remain where they were. She didn't ask anything else. Then she heard herself open her mouth a second time, and this time, she knew she was speaking. "I had a younger sister." Elias didn't turn around, but he didn't leave, either. Nell, she was 19. Corinne looked at the patch of floor before her, the patch she had scrubbed clean long ago, though her hand still held the brush against it. "That night, 2 years ago, I worked a double shift. I worked the afternoon shift at a laundromat, then went to a diner downtown for the night shift, 14 hours without a break. I left my phone in my locker because we weren't allowed to carry phones on the floor. She called me. She called while it was raining, out on Route 6, and she called me instead of anyone else. I didn't answer. The kitchen was silent. There was only the hum of the exhaust fan and the sound of water dripping into the sink no one had ever called anyone to repair. They called me near dawn. I left the kitchen still wearing my apron, took the bus to the hospital, and I never went back to that job." She paused for a while. "For 2 years, I've lived with one thing. She had been lying out there in the rain, alone, holding her phone and calling her sister, while her sister was here scrubbing this floor. She lowered her head, picked up the brush, and continued scrubbing because her hands needed something to do." Elias said nothing. He didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. He didn't tell her she had done everything she could, that anyone would have done the same, or that time would ease the pain. He didn't walk toward her. He remained beside the sink, with both hands braced against the stainless steel edge, his head slightly bowed, and he stayed there until she finished scrubbing that section of the floor. Then he went upstairs. The oak door closed very softly behind him. About half an hour later, Renato came up from the cold storage room in the basement. He was carrying a crate of butter. Corinne heard his footsteps before she saw him and stopped working, because what she heard wasn't merely the sound of footsteps. When Renato reached the top of the stairs, he placed the crate on the final step and stood there with one hand against the wall, breathing. He breathed through his mouth in short gasps, unable to draw any of them completely into his lungs, and at the end of each breath came a thin wheeze like wind slipping through a crack in a door. Corinne set down the brush, walked over, and lifted the crate for him. "Mr. Renato, I'm only getting old," he said, still trying to catch his breath. "This isn't old age. That wheeze at the end of your breath, how long have you had it?" He waved one hand dismissively. "I carry a heavy crate, so I breathe hard. You should see a doctor. There is a lung specialist at my mother's facility. I can ask for you." Renato laughed and took the crate of butter back from her. "Take care of your mother, Miss Delaney. I've stood at that stove longer than you've been alive. I know my lungs better than you do." She wrote it in her car beneath the dome light, on the back of a delivery invoice she had taken from the scrap paper bin. She wrote it in ballpoint pen, starting over 3 times until there were no more crossed-out places, and she spent a long time doing the division because she wanted the monthly amount to be one she knew she could pay even during the weeks when she slept in her car. She wrote down the total amount she owed, the amount she would pay each month, and the number of years it would take. That number of years was longer than she had been alive. She signed her full name at the bottom. The following night, she went upstairs and knocked on the door. He sat at the head of the long table with no one else in the room, and he left her standing there for a while before glancing toward the tabletop. Corinne placed the paper before him, pushed it in his direction, then stepped back exactly 1 pace. Elias picked it up. He read everything, including the places she had crossed out, and his eyes stopped on the final line where she had written the number of years. Then he tore the paper. He tore it in half, placed the 2 halves together, tore them again, and arranged the pieces on the table in one small, orderly stack. "You're beginning to think I'm a good man," he said. Corinne didn't answer. "I've seen it on your face for the past few days. You pass me in the kitchen, and you look at me the way people look at someone who has done something worthy. I need you to stop doing that." He pushed the stack of torn paper aside. "I know your mother's name. I know the name of the doctor treating her. I know her room number, which wing she is in. and what her window looks out upon. Yet I've never met her, not even once. I never will. Do you see what is wrong with that, Miss Delaney?" Corinne remained still. She looked at the stack of torn paper on the table, the paper she had sat in her car and rewritten 3 times, and she felt heat rise in her throat. "I'm not thanking you," she said. Elias looked up. "I didn't come up here to thank you. I haven't said those words to you since the first night, and I'm not saying them now." Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't tremble. "I only wanted you to know that I keep a record. I write down everything I owe. I've done it since the first time my mother went into the hospital. I record even the things people give me and tell me not to think about. I even recorded the meal Renato cooked for me in the kitchen that night. People can tear it up, but I'll still write it down. That is my responsibility, not yours." Elias looked at her. He said nothing more. Then he lowered his eyes to the file before him and opened it, the gesture of a man ending a conversation, and Corinne walked out, closed the door behind her, and descended the wooden stairs. She scrubbed until her shift was over. Before leaving, she entered the staff room and went to the locker at the beginning of the row beneath the light. The locker with the strip of black plastic bearing her name in raised white letters. She inserted the key and opened it. Inside, a thin envelope stood upright against the wall of the locker. Corinne took it out. It was light. She had spent enough years living beneath the surface of everything to know the weight of an envelope containing money, and this wasn't one. She opened it. Inside was a printed sheet of paper folded into thirds. It was the Beckwith House shuttle schedule, with a route from downtown, 3 trips each week, and the departure times clearly printed in the left column. At the bottom was her name, typed on the list of registered passengers. There was no invoice. There was no note explaining who had paid. Along the upper edge of the paper, in the white margin, 4 words had been written in ballpoint pen. The handwriting slanted, written quickly, with no name beneath it. "Sit beside the window." Corinne stood before the open locker with the paper held in both hands. 3 trips each week. It meant that 3 times a week, she wouldn't have to stand at a bus stop at 5 o'clock in the morning waiting for the first bus, wouldn't have to change routes twice, and wouldn't have to walk the final stretch that the bus couldn't reach. It meant that 3 times a week, she would arrive at her mother's side with enough strength left to stay and sit with her. She folded the paper along its original creases, slipped it back into the envelope, and returned it to the place where it had stood inside the locker. Then she closed the locker door, turned the key, and stood there with the key in her hand, unable to understand who the man was who had torn apart her promise to repay him only 2 hours earlier. 3 weeks earlier, Trevor Lund had stood at the side door with 2 cups of coffee and asked her for something. The fish delivery was arriving too early, at 5 o'clock in the morning, and Dale wouldn't have started his shift by then, so there would be no one to open the door for them. Trevor asked whether she had a key to the side door. If she lent it to him, he would have another one made and return hers. Corinne gave it to him. She even told him he could keep it because she could get another one from Renato. That night was a Friday, close to 2 o'clock in the morning, and she was standing on the ladder wiping the top of the ventilation system when the fire alarm began to scream. The alarm above her sounded first, then the second one in the staff hallway, and then every alarm in the building. She heard people running across the wooden floor upstairs. The smoke descended quickly. It wasn't coming from the kitchen. It came from the direction of the side door, pouring through the staff hallway. And it wasn't gray. It was brown and thick, the kind of smoke produced by something other than wood. Corinne jumped down from the ladder. She didn't run for the door. She ran to the valve behind the stove, the brass valve concealed behind the stainless steel panel she had to remove every night to scrub the area behind it, and turned it as far as it would go. That was the kitchen cleaner's responsibility and no one else's, and she knew the location of that valve better than she knew where the light switch was in her own home. Then she went to the fire door at the entrance to the hallway, the thick door separating the kitchen from the staff corridor, and pulled it closed to cut off the smoke flowing into the kitchen. She managed to close it 2/3 of the way. While she was holding it, she heard someone coughing on the other side, beyond the brown smoke. It wasn't a single cough. It was the coughing of someone who couldn't draw enough air into his lungs to finish coughing. "Mr. Bacci." No one answered. She shouted again, and this time she heard someone striking a door, weakly, somewhere near the end of the hallway. The dry storage room was there. Every night, a stack of flower crates was temporarily placed outside its door to wait until morning, when they would be moved to the basement. Corinne ran back into the kitchen, turned on the faucet, soaked the large cloth she usually used to mop the floor, wrung it out quickly, and pressed it over her face. She took a second cloth, soaked it, folded it, and held it in one hand. Then she lowered herself to the floor and crawled into the hallway. There was still air close to the floor. She had read that in a book many years earlier. In a classroom she had been only one semester away from leaving behind forever, and that was the only thing from that place that had followed her into this night. She crawled. She moved along the base of the wall on her right, because she knew a cold water pipe ran beside it, and she could follow it with her hand. The farther she went, the hotter it became. It wasn't the heat of flames. It was like standing before an open oven, the kind of heat that pressed against the skin of her face and turned breathing into something she had to remember to do. Then, something fell ahead of her, followed by the sound of flour crates sliding across the floor, and she heard a man's voice. "Get down." Elias was already in there. He had passed the stack of crates and cleared them away, and she saw his shape within the brown smoke, crouching low with one hand on the handle of the dry storage room door. Corinne crawled toward him and held out the second wet cloth. The door opened. Renato was inside, pressed close to the floor where there was still air. Corinne covered his face with the wet cloth and held it there. "Breathe through this. Don't say anything. Just breathe." Elias hauled him up. Corinne went ahead, following the cold water pipe along the base of the wall with one hand and counting each section so she would know how far they were from the fire door, because by then she couldn't see anything at all. When her hand finally touched the edge of that heavy door, she pushed it open and held it while all three of them passed through. The smoke was thinner in the kitchen. Corinne pulled the fire door shut behind them. They left through the rear kitchen door, emerged into the alley, and stepped into the rain. Renato lay on the wet concrete and coughed without stopping. And Corinne had heard that cough once before, several nights earlier. On the steps leading from the cold storage room, she had warned him about it, and he had waved her concern away. The fire engines turned into the alley, their lights sweeping across the walls on both sides. Corinne knelt on the wet ground beside him, holding the damp cloth over his face with one hand, and she couldn't think of anything except one small detail that seemed to have no place in that moment. The side door hadn't been forced open. The ambulance took Renato away while it was still dark. They gave him oxygen on the ground in the alley before lifting him onto the stretcher, and before the ambulance doors closed, he managed to find Corinne's eyes and raise one finger from the side rail. The firefighters left later, after making a complete sweep of the second floor and opening every window to let the smoke escape. Someone asked her several questions, wrote her name on a clipboard, then told her the kitchen hadn't burned, only the staff hallway and the storage area, and that she should go wash her face. By nearly 5 o'clock in the morning, the alley was empty, and only 2 people remained in the entire building. Half the kitchen lights were still working. The floor was covered with water and black soot, and stretcher wheel marks crossed the place Corinne had scrubbed the night before. Elias sat on the cutting counter, where the thick wooden surface had absorbed the water, and rolled up his right sleeve. A long burn ran across his forearm. Corinne retrieved the first aid kit from the cabinet above the stove, a steel box bolted to the wall that no one had opened since she started working there. Inside were gauze pads, rolls of bandages, and several expired items that she returned to their places. She turned on the faucet, waited until the water was cool enough, and held his arm beneath it for a long time, longer than most people would have thought necessary. He didn't pull away. "Let the water run over it," she said. "The longer, the better. This has to be done immediately. If you wait until morning, it will hurt much more." She patted the skin around the burn dry, without touching the burn itself, then placed a non-stick gauze pad over it, and wrapped the bandage snugly without tightening it. Her hands knew how to do all of it without thought. "Where did you learn this?" Elias asked. "Nursing school," she said. "I nearly finished. I had 1 semester left." She cut the bandage with the scissors from the kit and secured the end. 2 years ago, when my mother had her first stroke, I dropped out to pay her bills. I took any shift I could find day and night until everything collapsed after Nell died. 11 months ago, Renato hired me here. She placed the scissors on the counter. The kitchen was silent then, with the silence of a place that had only recently been filled with noise. "Mr. Marchetti." He looked up. "Why are you doing all these things for me?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked at the bandage on his forearm for a while, then he spoke slowly, with the measured pace of someone carrying something heavy through a narrow passage. "Have you ever kept a ledger? Not one for money. The kind where a person records the things he has done." Corinne didn't answer. I keep one. Not on paper, but I keep it. He turned his hand over and looked at his palm. The column on this side is long. It has been growing since I was a teenager. There are entries in it that I can't bring myself to read anymore. For many years, I thought that if I did something for someone, something significant, I could subtract one line. He lowered his hand. I've tried. I've tried many times, Miss Delaney. The number doesn't change. Nothing can be subtracted. Corinne stood beside the cutting counter, her hands still wet. Then why? My mother died in a room without a window, he said. They placed her in the last room at the end of the hall, where they put the people no one ever called to ask about. It wasn't because they were cruel. It was because no one in that building knew her name. I went there. I asked about her, and they had to open a ledger before they could read my own mother's name to me. He looked at Corinne. Now I have enough money to buy half this city. I can buy the harbor. I can buy 40 minutes of people waiting for me without a single one daring to leave. But I can't buy back a name. Corinne said nothing. She didn't tell him she understood, because she wasn't certain that she did. And she offered no words of comfort, because she had learned several nights earlier that he wouldn't accept them. She picked up the remaining roll of bandage, wound it neatly, and returned it to the steel box. Elias climbed down from the cutting counter. He lowered his sleeve over the bandage and walked into the staff hallway, where the floor was still wet and the walls had turned black, to see what had been taken. Corinne followed him. Everything in the dry storage room was gone. Some of the files upstairs were missing. The wine cabinet beneath the stairs had been emptied completely. The row of gray-painted metal staff lockers still stood in place, blackened on one side. And when Corinne opened Renato's locker with the spare key kept in the kitchen, the leather-bound notebook was still lying untouched at the bottom. No one had taken it because no one in that entire building considered it property. At noon that day, she sat in a small room at the fire department headquarters and gave her statement. The investigator's name was Alden. His hair was silver at the temples. He asked his questions very slowly, and he wrote everything by hand instead of typing it. He asked where she had first heard the alarm, which direction the smoke had come from, and who had still been inside the building, and she answered every question. Then he asked the question she had been expecting since the moment she walked into the room. Had there been any sign that the side door was forced open? Corinne said no. He wrote that down. The restaurant hadn't been the target. Upstairs, there was an old safe containing decades of records from the dock workers' union pension fund, records no one had ever agreed to digitize, and someone had opened it before the smoke reached the kitchen. The fire was merely what they had left behind. Alden told her those two things and stopped there. He didn't say anything more, and she didn't ask. Late that afternoon, she returned to the restaurant to collect her belongings from her locker. Several of Elias's men stood talking in the alley, and she overheard part of their conversation. They were discussing who had a key to the side door. She stopped. She stood there with her key ring in her hand and lifted each key to count them. The kitchen key, the locker key, the car key, and the key to the rented room with 3 bunk beds. The key to the side door wasn't there. She had given it away 3 weeks earlier. She had given it to a man standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, and she had even told him to keep it because she could always get another one. Corinne sat down on the step outside the alley door and remained there for a long time. She didn't think about Trevor. His face wasn't in her mind. Neither was the early fish delivery or the cup of coffee without sugar. What returned to her thoughts was something entirely different. It was the locker in the staff room and the phone that had remained inside it for 14 hours, and the rainy night on Route 6. Both times, what she had needed to do was something very small. Open the locker and check her phone once. Say one word, no, to the person asking for the key. 2 things so small that no one in the world would ever record them in any ledger. That evening, she went upstairs because someone had come down to summon her. Elias sat at the head of the long table, his forearm wrapped in a neater bandage, and there was one other person in the room. A broad-shouldered man somewhere in his 40s, his coat buttoned to the neck, standing beside the window. Emmett Kroll. She had seen him enter and leave through the front door many times, but she had never spoken with him. Corinne told them about the key. She told them everything, including exactly what she had said to Trevor. She made no attempt to lessen her responsibility. When she finished, Emmett Kroll left the window and approached the table. Then it's settled, he said. I know where that boy is. Leave it to me, and by tomorrow morning, the matter will be over. He spoke in the tone people used when discussing the replacement of a broken pipe. Then he glanced toward Corinne. As for her, get her out of the city. She spent the entire afternoon sitting in a room giving a statement, as you know. Send her somewhere for a few months, somewhere no one will ask questions. That will make things easier for everyone. Corinne stood motionless in the middle of the room. She waited. Elias didn't answer. He sat there with both hands resting on the table, and he couldn't speak, not because he refused to, but because he was unable to, and everyone in the room realized it at the same moment. Emmett Kroll turned and looked at him. Corinne looked at him too, and understood that she was witnessing something that had never happened in that room before. Elias, Kroll said. Leave it, Elias said. He spoke those two words and nothing more. Kroll remained there for another moment, then picked up his coat and walked out, and the sound of his footsteps descending the wooden stairs was very clear. The hospital called the following morning. Renato had pulled through. They said he would be able to go home sometime that week. They also said the smoke had permanently damaged part of his lungs, that he would have to carry an oxygen tank whenever he traveled any distance, and that he could no longer stand for extended periods in the heat. Corinne listened to the entire call in the corridor at Beckwith House, one hand still holding the door handle to her mother's room. He would never stand at that stove again. That was what the night had taken from him, and no one could ever give it back. 3 nights later, he sent someone downstairs to call her up. There were only 2 people in the room. There were no files and no glasses on the long table, and Corinne knew immediately that this had nothing to do with the restaurant. Sit down, he said. She sat. Elias opened the drawer on the right side of the desk. He removed a sheet of paper folded into thirds, the faded print of the kind of form used by ambulance crews, placed it on the table, pushed it toward her, then withdrew his hand. I've kept this for 2 years. Corinne unfolded it. She read from top to bottom. The date, the time, the location identified by a mile marker on Route 6, then the name of the person who had been transported, and it was her sister's name. Corinne had seen this form before. Not this exact sheet, but one just like it. Someone had given it to her at the hospital that night, along with a plastic bag containing Nell's belongings, and she could no longer remember where she had put it, but this copy contained a line that hers didn't. Near the bottom, in the section identifying the person who had reported the incident, a name had been written by hand. Elias Marchetti. Corinne looked up. That night, I didn't give anyone my name, he said. They asked, and I didn't answer. I got into my car and left before the second ambulance arrived. This name was added much later, after my lawyer obtained a copy of the record, and they filled it in. He looked at the paper in her hands. I needed it. I needed there to be somewhere in this world where it was recorded that I had been there. If you ask me why, I'll tell you the truth. I don't know. Corinne couldn't speak. She stared at that line as her hands began to tremble, and she had to lower the paper onto the table to keep it from making a sound. Tell me what happened, she said. Elias didn't lean back. He sat upright with both hands resting on the table and spoke in the voice of someone reciting something he had read many times in his mind. It was raining. I was driving on Route 6, and I had to stop. I called emergency services from my phone, gave them the mile marker, and they said 15 minutes. I got out of the car. I took off my coat and covered her with it, because the rain was cold, and she was cold. Then I sat beside her and held her hand. He stopped. They arrived after 17 minutes. I remember that number because I kept looking at my watch the entire time. Corinne raised one hand to her mouth. She could speak, Elias said. Not much. She managed a few sentences, and there was one thing she said twice, so I knew she wanted me to hear it clearly. He looked at her. She said, "Don't let my sister know I called. My sister is at work." The room was so quiet that Corinne could hear the heating system running beneath the floor. She sat there and felt the last 2 years of her life turn upside down, every part of them, from beginning to end. The thing that had lain at the bottom of those years all that time, the thing she carried while scrubbing floors, while sleeping in her car, and while answering a call bearing her sister's name at 2:10 in the morning, turned out not to be true. Nell hadn't lain out there alone. Someone had covered her with his coat. Someone had held her hand. Then heat surged through Corinne, rising quickly, and it wasn't gratitude. Corinne stood. "You kept this for 2 years." Elias said nothing. "You kept it in this drawer for 2 years. Her voice broke on the word drawer. "For 2 years, I slept in my car. Do you know what I kept on the back seat? Her coat. I couldn't give it to anyone, and I couldn't throw it away. Every morning, I folded it with my blanket, And I slept in that car believing my sister had died on the road in the rain with no one beside her. 2 years, and you had that piece of paper lying in a drawer, 1 flight of stairs above the floor I scrubbed. She stood there with her arms hanging at her sides, her breathing short. You erased my debt. You paid for my mother's care. You gave me medicine, a locker with my name on it, and a place on the shuttle where I could sit beside the window. Why didn't you give me this? Elias rose from his chair. He didn't step toward her. He didn't apologize. Because if I had given you that paper, he said, you would have found peace. You would have been able to sleep. You would have left this place and found other work, and I would have had nothing left to do. He looked at her, and his voice didn't change in the slightest. I didn't want to have nothing left to do, Miss Delaney. She didn't go upstairs for several days after that. Then one afternoon, someone summoned her to a law office on the 4th floor of a building on Westminster Street. Elias was waiting in the conference room with an older woman in a gray suit, his attorney, whose name was Hollis. Several sets of documents had been arranged on the table, each clipped into a separate section. Sit down, Miss Delaney, Mrs. Hollis said. I need you to confirm something for me. That packet of papers you signed in the hospital corridor that year, did you sign all of them at the same time? Yes. Did anyone read each document aloud to you? No. He pointed to the blank spaces, and I signed. Mrs. Hollis removed 1 sheet from the packet, placed it in front of Corinne, and pointed to a box near the bottom. This isn't a loan agreement. This is a healthcare power of attorney. It authorizes someone to make decisions on behalf of the family regarding treatment facilities, hospital transfers, and admission documents. You signed it at the same time as everything else. Corinne looked at the box. A name had been typed into the space for the authorized representative, and it wasn't hers. Legally, Mrs. Hollis said, you aren't Faye Delaney's family representative. Corinne remembered a 3rd-floor corridor and a woman in a lab coat turning through the file, telling her that the matter would have to be clarified, probably sometime that week. She remembered answering that she would correct whatever was wrong, then entering the room because her mother was behind that door. Erasing the debt didn't solve anything, Mrs. Hollis continued. The debt is gone. This document remains in full effect. As long as it remains valid, they can move Faye anywhere, at any time, without breaking a single law. You won't have the right to stop them. Your only option will be to file a lawsuit, and a lawsuit will take months. The room was silent. Elias sat at the head of the table, and he hadn't moved since Corinne entered. Then what does he want with my mother? Corinne asked. He doesn't want her, Elias said. Those were the first words he had spoken. She isn't the objective, Miss Delaney. She is the means of collecting the money. Mrs. Hollis nodded. Hodge lends people money and makes them sign both documents at the same time. The loan agreement allows him to recover his money. The power of attorney ensures that no one dares fall behind on a payment. If someone is a week late, he calls with a reminder, and they understand what he holds in his hands. So they find the money. They always find it. Corinne remembered those same words coming through the phone speaker in the empty kitchen. No patient has ever actually been transferred, Mrs. Hollis said. He doesn't need to move anyone. He only needs people to be afraid. Then she picked up the thickest packet on the table and pushed it toward Elias. And she isn't the only one. We traced the notary and obtained the complete list. Elias opened it. Corinne sat across from him and couldn't read the words, but she could see that the list was longer than she had expected. Much longer, continuing from one page onto the next. Mrs. Hollis kept speaking as he read. Almost everyone on it is caring for a seriously ill family member. Children caring for parents, wives caring for husbands. The same hospital corridor, the same story about a free assistance program. Hodge doesn't search for desperate people, Mr. Marchetti. He sits in the place where desperate people have no choice but to pass. Elias didn't answer her. He continued reading, one finger moving down the page line by line until it stopped at the 7th entry. He said nothing. He sat staring at that line for so long that Mrs. Hollis finally followed his gaze. Then he turned the packet around and pushed it into the center of the table so the other two could read it. Renato Bacci. Corinne stared at the name and heard again the thin wheeze at the end of a breath on the steps from the cold storage room on the night she had urged him to see a doctor, and he had waved her concern away. He signed many years ago, Mrs. Hollis said, her voice quieter than before. His wife was ill. He borrowed money, and he has paid the interest regularly, every month, out of his wages. Elias still said nothing. Where does he make the payments? Corinne asked. Mrs. Hollis looked at Elias, then at her. Someone comes to collect them at the restaurant's side door. Elias rose from his chair. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to both women, remaining that way for a long time. Corinne heard him speak, though not loudly. He has cooked for me since I wasn't tall enough to see over the cutting counter. Mrs. Hollis gathered the papers into a neat stack. We asked him about it at the hospital yesterday. He said he never told you because you already had enough to deal with. The lawsuit was filed that same week, and her first hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning. Corinne was the only person on that entire list willing to put her name on it. The night before the hearing, she didn't return to the rooming house. She finished her shift and went straight to Beckwith House. Asked the night attendant if she could stay, and they allowed her inside. She sat in the extra plastic chair beside her mother's bed, rested her head against the bed rail, and slept, the way people slept when they knew that in the morning they would have to speak a truth aloud before strangers. What awakened her was the sound of stretcher wheels. It was a sound she knew. Wheels rolling across vinyl flooring had a rhythm of their own, 2 small clicks at every seam, and she had listened to that sound in countless corridors for 2 years. It was drawing closer. Then it stopped directly outside the door. Corinne opened her eyes, and there were already people inside the room. 3 people wearing the uniforms of a medical transportation company, and a woman holding a clipboard, stood at the foot of the bed. The stretcher had been pushed into the center of the room. No one turned on the overhead light. There were only the night lights near the base of the walls, and everyone moved quietly, following procedure with the practiced ease of people who had done this many times before. "Are you the patient's daughter?" the woman asked. "You can remain seated. We have all the necessary documents. She is being transferred to a facility outside the city. The vehicle is waiting downstairs in the lobby." Corinne rose from the chair. She stood slowly because both legs had gone numb, took 3 steps out of the narrow space between the chair and the bed, then positioned herself in the opening before the door with her back against its edge. "Show me the documents." The woman held out the clipboard without the slightest hesitation. That was the frightening part. Corinne read them, and they were valid. There was a transfer request. There was the name of the receiving facility. There was a date, a time, and a case number. At the bottom, inside the box reserved for the family representative, there was a signature, and the name printed beneath it was the same name Corinne had read in the conference room on the 4th floor of the Westminster Street building several days earlier. "I don't consent to this," she said. "You aren't the authorized representative," the woman replied. Her voice wasn't harsh. "I understand that family matters can be complicated, but we can only follow the documents. You can call your attorney tomorrow." The other 3 had already begun lowering the bed rail. Corinne reached into her coat pocket and removed the only thing she had with her, her nursing school student identification card, a card that had expired several years earlier, but that she still carried in her wallet. She held it up. "I studied nursing. I didn't earn my degree, but I learned enough to know this." She spoke slowly, 1 word at a time, because she needed to say it correctly. "My mother is in the middle of a dialysis cycle. Her next treatment is scheduled for tomorrow morning. A patient in an active cycle can't be transferred to another facility without confirmation from her attending physician, personally signed and marked with the time. You have the family representative's signature. You don't have the doctor's signature." No one said anything. Which machine is used for her treatment here? Who placed her catheter? On what day was her last session? Who monitored her blood pressure during it? Corinne looked directly at the woman holding the clipboard. "Can you answer any of those questions?" "Because I can answer all 4. And if you place her on that stretcher tonight, and something happens tomorrow morning, the name in the record won't be mine." The woman looked down at her clipboard. She turned 1 page, then turned it back. One of the other 3 had stopped lowering the bed rail and didn't continue. At that moment, footsteps sounded in the corridor, and Elias entered the room. He was still wearing his coat, and didn't remove it. He didn't look at any of the 3 transport workers. He didn't approach the stretcher. He took out his phone, dialed a number, placed it on the bedside cabinet, and turned on the speaker. A man's voice came through from the other end, the voice of someone who had just been dragged out of bed but still had to speak. The man began to read. He read the name of the transportation company. He read the professional license number of every worker present in the room, reading very slowly, and then he read their names, all 3 of them, in the correct order. Then he read the name of the person who had hired the vehicle for that night and the address of that person's office. Then there was silence. No one said another word. Nothing was said about what would happen. The woman tucked the clipboard beneath her arm and told the other three to raise the bed rail. They raised it, wheeled the stretcher out, and left. Corinne listened as the sound of its wheels receded down the corridor before she dared release her grip on the edge of the door. "Did you just threaten them?" she asked. Elias picked up the phone from the bedside cabinet. "No, I merely let them know they have names. People with names don't dare do anonymous work." Her dialysis treatment that morning took place on schedule. Corinne waited outside, and when they brought her mother back to the room, she followed them inside and sat in the plastic chair. Faye slept for a while. Then she opened her eyes, and this time, her gaze didn't wander around the room. She found her daughter immediately. Corinne. It had been 2 years since Corinne had heard her mother call her by the right name. She leaned forward and took her hand. "I'm here, Mom." Faye looked at her. Her gaze moved from Corinne's face to her neck, then down to her shoulders. The gaze of a woman examining her child in the same way she had since Corinne was little. Then she spoke, and the sentence emerged whole, slowly, but without a single word missing. "You're too thin. Where do you sleep?" Corinne opened her mouth, but nothing came out. At 3 o'clock that morning, she had stood blocking the door to this room with an expired card in her hand, and she hadn't broken. She had sat in the small room and given her statement. She had read the name inside the authorization box. She had stood in a burning kitchen, and she had endured all of it. It was that question that broke her. She folded herself over the side of the bed, buried her face in the blanket, and sobbed aloud, unable to hold anything back. The sobs of someone who had been holding on for far too long. Her mother placed a hand on her head. "Don't," she said. "Don't." Then she tried to say something else, but the words wouldn't come, so she fell silent and tried again. "The car. Your car." She couldn't finish the thought, but she lifted Corinne's hand and moved it into the light from the window, then studied both of her daughter's hands for a long time, looking at the cracked knuckles, and her face tightened with pain. "I took everything from you," she said. "Your youth. I took it all." "No, Mom." Corinne raised her face, still holding her mother's hand in both of hers. "You gave me somewhere to come home to." Faye looked at her. Then she asked where Nell was, and Corinne said Nell had gone to work and hadn't come home yet. Faye nodded and closed her eyes, and that moment of clarity ended. It had lasted less time than it took to fetch a glass of water. They had both waited 2 years for it, and it lasted only a few minutes. In the corridor, Renato stood with his back against the wall beside the door, one hand holding the tube connected to the small oxygen tank at his side. He had been out of the hospital for 2 days and had arrived that morning. A few steps away stood Elias, still wearing his coat, his hands in his pockets. He didn't go inside. He had remained in the corridor the entire time Faye was awake, facing the window at the end of the hall. "Go in," Renato said. "No, she's awake. Go in and say hello to her." Elias didn't turn his head. "I don't have that, mister. Bocce." The old man looked at him for a while, then let the matter go without saying another word, and the two of them stood there together until Corinne opened the door and came out. That afternoon, Mrs. Hollis called Elias back to her office. Corinne went with him because the attorney said she should be present. This time, there was only one thin file on the conference table. "We traced the man backing Hodge's operation," Mrs. Hollis said. "He couldn't have run that kind of scheme in this territory on his own. He needed someone behind him to tell people that he had permission to operate. That name is in the records, and it has been there for many years." She pushed the paper across the table. Elias picked it up. He read it, and Corinne watched his face, but she saw nothing at all. Nothing moved in his expression. That frightened her more. He placed the paper on the table and turned it so she could read it. Emmett Kroll. "Did he know about the fire?" Corinne asked. "No," Mrs. Hollis said. "That was an entirely separate matter, paid for by someone else, and we already have enough evidence. Mr. Kroll wasn't involved in any part of it. He only backed the lending operation." "For how long?" "Since long before you began working here." Elias still said nothing. Mrs. Hollis gathered the papers and added one more thing, her voice different now. "I met with him this morning, Mr. Marchetti. I asked whether he knew who the people signing those documents were. He said lending money was business, that people borrowed when they needed money, and that even if he had stopped it, someone else would have lent to them." She paused. Then he said one more thing. He said those people weren't ours. That evening, the second floor was crowded. People sat along both sides of the long table. Others stood against the walls, and no one knew why they had been summoned. Corinne had been called upstairs as well, and she stood at the far end of the room beside the door. Elias entered last. He carried two things. One was a leather-bound notebook worn at all four corners, its spine repaired with tape that had yellowed with age. The other was a clipped packet of papers. He placed the notebook on the table before Emmett Kroll, opened it, turned to a page discolored with age, and placed one finger on a line written in blue ink. "Read it." Emmett looked at the notebook, then raised his eyes. "Elias, read it aloud." No one in the room moved. Emmett lowered his gaze to the page and read. He spoke the name of a woman, and the last name that followed it. He read it in a very quiet voice, and he knew what he was reading. Everyone in the room could see that on his face. Elias pulled the notebook back, closed it, and pushed the packet of papers into its place. "Read this, too." Emmett didn't pick it up. "Read all of it," Elias said. "We have the entire night." Emmett Kroll lifted the packet. He read the first name, then the second. He stopped at the fourth, but Elias said nothing, so he continued. Women's names, men's names, surnames that sounded as though they belonged to people from the east side of the city, where rows of 3-story wooden houses stood. By the middle of the first page, his voice had gone dry. He cleared his throat and kept reading. When he reached the name Renato Bacci, everyone in the room could hear that he hadn't known it would be there. He managed several more lines before his voice failed. He sat with the papers held in both hands, unable to continue. Elias took the packet from him. "How many years have you sat beside me, Emmett?" No one answered. "You are the only person in this building who knows why I keep that unprofitable restaurant downstairs. I haven't told that story to anyone else in my entire life. Yet you still put your name behind a man who sat waiting in hospital corridors to hand documents to people caring for their mothers." Elias placed the packet on the table. "Stand up and walk out that door. You can keep your car. You can keep your house and your money. I won't take a single dollar from you. But from tonight onward, no one in this city will answer the phone when you call." Emmett Kroll rose from his chair. He took 2 steps away from the table, then dropped to his knees on the wooden floor and began to speak, speaking quickly, repeating the same thing in different words, saying he hadn't known, that he had never thought about it that way. That after all these years, Elias looked down at him. "Stand up." He didn't reach inside his coat. He didn't take anything out. Emmett Kroll rose without assistance and walked to the door on his own, and no one in the room stood to escort him. The door closed behind him. Then Elias ordered everyone downstairs, and they went, leaving only 2 people in the room. He walked to the desk, opened a drawer, and placed an envelope before Corinne. It was thick. "There is a bank draft inside," he said. "There is also the deed to a house out of state. It has already been transferred into your name. Your final semester has been paid in full, and the receipt is in there. You can leave as early as this week." Corinne opened the envelope. She removed each item, placed it on the table, and read everything. She read the amount on the bank draft, the amount she had needed for so many years, the amount that would have kept her from signing anyone's documents that night in the hospital corridor. Then she arranged the papers into a stack, and she tore them. She didn't do it with anger, but with a quiet, deliberate firmness, ripping the thick paper down the middle and dropping the torn strips onto the desk between them. "You're not allowed to pay this debt in full," she said. "No one can settle that kind of debt with money, Mr. Marchetti. No matter how much you pay, your number won't change. You told me that in the kitchen. Do you remember?" Elias said nothing. "You gave me a locker with my name on it, and now you're paying me to abandon it and leave." She pushed the stack of torn paper into the center of the table. "I've been invisible for most of my life. I won't sell myself just to become invisible again." Then she said what she had come upstairs to say. "I'm appearing at the hearing on Thursday morning. I'll testify to exactly what I saw, adding nothing and leaving nothing out, including the fact that I was the one who gave Trevor the key. As for Trevor, let the authorities deal with him. Don't send anyone after him. If you do, then Mr. Bacci sitting out there breathing from an oxygen tank will become nothing more than another line in your ledger." He didn't have Trevor Lund dealt with. He turned over the entire operation, the complete packet of documents, and everything Mrs. Hollis had uncovered about the person who hired the transport vehicle that night. He gave it all to Alden at the fire department and to the prosecutors, and he sat through one interrogation after another. He knew that once he opened that door, they would open his own books as well, and they did. He lost the harbor. He lost the transportation union. His name appeared in the newspapers for weeks, buried in the inside columns, and the court placed him under supervision for 2 years, along with a long list of things he was no longer permitted to do. He kept exactly one thing: the restaurant on Atwells Avenue. Trevor went to trial and was sentenced. The person who had paid him went to trial later, and Corinne testified to exactly what she had seen, including the fact that she had given him the key. Her mother's care had been paid in full long before, so when everything belonging to Elias was opened and examined, that remained untouched. No one could reach it. 1 year later, the restaurant reopened. It was smaller than before, with fewer tables, and every line on the shift schedule posted beside the kitchen door bore a person's name. The dishwashing area now had a window. They had to break through part of a load-bearing wall to install it, which cost far more than leaving the wall untouched, and the architect said so plainly, but he was ordered to do it anyway. Corinne learned something else as well, and she learned it from Renato, not from Elias. The harsh, degreasing chemical that had eaten into her skin had been removed from all 4 restaurants long ago, during her first few weeks there, and replaced with another kind that cost much more. Elias had never said a word to her about it. The Marchetti name wasn't displayed on the wall by the entrance. Instead, a small brass plaque had been mounted there, bearing the names of everyone who had ever worked a night shift in that kitchen, copied from a leather-bound notebook worn at all 4 corners, with no one missing. The first line bore the name of a woman whose last name was Marchetti. Near the bottom was the name Corinne Delaney. At Sunday lunch, the dining room was full. Renato sat at the corner table with his small oxygen tank beside his feet, directing the kitchen with his voice, and calling out whenever he saw someone leave something over the flame for too long. His 2 grandchildren sat at the table with him, fighting over the final piece of cake on the plate, and bursting into laughter when it was divided in half. Faye sat beside the window where the light fell, reaching out to stroke both children's hair. Corinne arrived later than everyone else. She was still wearing her lab coat because she had come directly from her shift. Beckwith House had hired her as a nursing assistant that spring, and had offered a program that helped employees finish their education, so she had enrolled in her final semester using her own money and that program. She would take her examination the following month. No one had given that to her. She had reclaimed it. She crossed the dining room and entered the kitchen. Elias stood at the sink at the far end, washing his hands slowly and thoroughly past his elbows, as he always did. Corinne took a dry towel from the rack, stood beside him, and held it out. He accepted it, patted his hands dry, and spoke more slowly than usual. That night on Route 6, I wasn't simply passing by. She remained silent. I was on my way to do something. I won't tell you what it was, and don't ask me, because I'll never answer. I'll only tell you that I was halfway there, and I'm not the kind of man who turns his car around halfway through a journey. He folded the towel. Then I had to stop because something happened on the road ahead of me. I stopped, called emergency services, and sat beside the road in the rain. By the time I was able to stand again, it was nearly dawn, and what I had set out to do could no longer be done. I never tried to do it again. He placed the towel on the edge of the sink. So don't thank me for staying beside your sister. Your sister saved someone that night, Miss Delaney. I didn't. He didn't explain another word. Then he looked at her and spoke the 2 words he hadn't said to anyone who worked for him in all those years. Thank you, Corinne. This story leaves us with one very simple truth. A person's greatest power doesn't lie in how much money they possess, but in their ability to see another human being and call that person by the right name. A man may be able to buy an entire harbor, yet remain unable to buy back his mother's name, while a woman who cleans a kitchen and has no money to her name can give him the very thing his entire fortune could never purchase. Please remember as well that no one is so poor that they have nothing left to give, because on a rainy night, a 19-year-old girl with no money and no power prevented something terrible from happening without ever knowing it. And finally, read every document carefully before you sign your name, especially in the moments when you are most vulnerable, because true kindness will never rush another person into signing quickly. If today's story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so that we can share more meaningful stories with you each day. Please share this video with someone you believe may need it. And how do you feel about Corinne's story? Leave us a comment, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always enjoy good health, a joyful life, and peace in every passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.